Aperture.
As Nicole mentioned, I'm both a sort of visual artist and a writer, and both of those things are sort of really important and kind of like inform each other in very complex and sometimes complicated ways. So every time I'm doing sort of an artist talk based on my visual practice, I always include a reading. It's especially appropriate here because I'll sort of read an excerpt from the project that was excerpted in the latest issue of Aperture, which was from an artist book that I made, which is kind of shown here. So I'll read an excerpt from that. I'll read another text, which potentially might seem unrelated, but there are ways that they all kind of like resonate and vibrate together, and that's the thing that's sort of important to me. Then I'll show a video, and then I'll get into like a super close reading of like some projects, and so we'll see like how my mind works a little bit. Okay, so the book that I made, which was excerpted in this issue, is titled Landscapes and Playgrounds, and so I'll just go through like an excerpt of some of the text in the book. So the first one I'm going to read is a letter from my father who's incarcerated. So, Sable Elyse Smith, February 9th. Hello, daughter. What did you do? Smile in parentheses. He wasn't working with emojis then. Hope you're being careful. You know the world is not all peaches and cream. Pay attention to your space and general area. Nell is sick. She has cancer. She is staying at Cleo's or my mother's, or check in with Marty. She's going through it. Love, Dad. The next text that's sort of excerpted in here is an appropriated text from a coloring book that I found a while ago that teaches children how to navigate the court system. So this is sort of one page, just essentially talking about metal detectors. And Pat the Pigeon is your kind of like friendly protagonist that guides you through the justice system. So Pat flies across the street and goes in line with all of the families. Inside, everyone is waiting to go through the arches called metal detectors. Court officers who dress all in blue use the metal detectors to make sure everyone inside the court is safe. Can you help Pat to the metal detectors? And then the last thing I'll read from this book is, again, another letter from my father from June 11th. Sable Elyse Smith. There's tons of exclamation points around this letter too, just so you have the visual effect. What did you do, daughter? Smile, in parentheses. Received the visiting form envelope. I had wrote a form to the visiting sergeant, and he called over to the building and talked to me about your visiting approval. He said you're cleared to visit. They're changing the paperwork over to computers. Someone mistakenly punched in male instead of female. He said to have you come down and visit either way, that you should be approved. His name is Visiting Sergeant Black. But by now you should submit a new form. It should actually be okay before you arrive. My mom said you didn't know if you'll be able to visit in July. She thought it was because of money. She says she's going to give you her round-trip plane ticket plus $50 to transfer it into your name so that you can visit, okay? Looking forward to seeing you, or looking forward to seeing my baby daughter. Smile, again, in parentheses. Love, Dad, aka Pop. The next text is a piece that actually was commissioned by Recess Art, and it was sort of made to be a response to a show that they had there, it was a show by a friend of mine who is also another sort of LA person, an artist named Lauren Halsey. And this text is titled Static Resilience. And so the party continues. Every night I dance to the triplet hi-hat trap boy fantasy. A slow cerebration deceptively similar to my code swap histories punctuated by an 808. Every night I dance to the sex-laced crescendo as bands make her dance, or the desire for another's body as the heart decelerates and drugs slowly seep out of the system. I only want you when I'm coming down, or fuck faces. There's a rhythm for everything. The party is about a moment of suspension, feeling a rigorous sensation in the body, a pulsating tip to tip like Paul B. Preciado's testo gel. The moment it seeps in is palpable. Like pins and needles all prickly across the skin surface, and a slow numb that calls attention to each beat of the heart harder and harder. And the sensation conjured by this dance is void of history, geographic location, and pain. It's a sensation that's without my scars or muscle memory. It is without his trauma of domestic violence. It is without the memory of crack or our 80s birth. It is without those small deposits of rage. It is without, because even the sweat releases something from the body. Without, because we are giving everything, and to splurge is an act of depletion. I've listened to my peers recite remixed versions of the names of the recent fallen lately. I've watched the spaces and white faces as the words leave lips. I moisten my lips to receive these names. I've inserted my own name at times, wondering the difference between me and them. I'm so moved by this murmur propping up each individual's performance or non-performance, propping up me as the energy in a space constricts and begins to envelop me and certain others in the audience. And I think about the camouflage of mourning, and how space shapes itself around each of our bodies, pushing in a little more each time. This is a chance. This is a chance. The dance, however, is not an escape. It is a punctuation. It is about claiming an instant of time and something that can be mine completely, though at times I share it with others, as we are all our own orbiting planets, spinning in excess and proximity to one another. And sometimes our bodies touch. Sometimes I run my shoulders up against his, and there's a transfer, a silent affirmation. We are taking up space at the same time and spinning the most delicate webs out of the strongest material imaginable. This is the dance. This is the work of living between the distinct moment when we push past exhaustion to elation, a static resilience glittering down. I want to dance slick with sweat and cum and saliva. I want to hold the body in a state of titillation, rushed to its peak by the simple act of being alive, by taking a breath, by breathing. The club is a sanctuary for queer liberation. Audre Lorde writes, "For those of us who live at the shorelines, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways, coming and going in the hours between dawns. In the beginning, they say, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." And the fiction continues. Being without form and void suggests a folding onto itself, so that it may always be both negating the other, while the dance just holds us in. Detaches our weight and gives us a small respite. It is a portal, a tiny dressing room to construct and sharpen our outfits, our attitudes, our swag, and presentation as we go out in the world and perform our positions, in the hopes to acquire or swap into other positions, permission to be amorphous. A woman I dated once was really attracted to my ability to slip. She put language to a fluidity that she identified in me. For her, my slippage to female was only visible when we fucked, though in fucking I oscillate back and forth in a way she did not find present as I walk through the world not fucking. And so I wonder about the rhythm of my walking. This walking through as opposed to being rested in. This pendulum sway from form to void. Funk music does not occupy a space separate from the sex and drugs. It is about a visceral manifestation of pleasure. To negate the flaw is detrimental. It is about sitting in a caprice on Slauson, slouched down in your seat real low, eyes below, blazed, 210s in your trunk listening to Bootsy, to Parliament, to E40, to Tupac, to Curtis, to the vibration in the seats that leave a plush velvet fabric and enters the spine, the forearms, the ass. A form created in the 60s, resistance is embedded in its syncopation. Funk is about the journey, and sometimes just to be a body feeling is revolutionary. I think of James Brown sliding across Ed Sullivan's stage in 1966, both exclaiming and singing, "I feel good." I think of the rapidity of his steps as an autonomous choreography that straddles a stark line between performance and refusal, an acknowledgement that at some point the ground would refuse to uphold. I see the ground buckling myself, and so we shake it. Shake it as vigorously as the earth shakes itself loose in California along certain fault lines in search of fluid space. Eddie Hazel lifts the gravity in one's room. He jams it into the chest cavity with one long note in E minor. A guitar solo played on top of itself echoes in the parts of us that have already been made hollow. Time stops. I imagine a callousness across the tips of his fingers, some hard shell of labor. Catharsis peaks with each wail of the guitar, and we float weightlessly deeper into the void. And maybe the body rattles like trunks when a deep bass vibrates through them. His guitar bleeds all the language out of the lament. It festers in the body. It sits against the spine, applying pressure. And I ponder that space between the moments where language falls away from sound, or the moment that sound becomes language, dragging with it a weight that resides in the body, forcing us to confront it. The music is both thick and empty, so that we may climb into it and be many selves at once, planted on tabletops, hips rocking back and forth, smiles slick across faces. Black joy is an act of resistance. So the second thing I'm going to do is play this video, which is about 8 minutes, and then I'll get into sort of talking about some of the ideas around the work. So the video is from a series of works that I'm making as sort of a collaboration between my father, and this one is titled Men Who Swallow Themselves in Shadows.
Drugs or weapons on you?
Spinning? No, I don't see it. Alright, start again. Of course they're not going to do it now. Right here.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
I seen lots of people killed before, but I ain't never done it myself. I mean, I never had a reason to.
Counting down our picks for the top 10 Hood films.
Now my friend, he's driving the van. He's looking at me at the corner of his eye like, saying, what are you going to say, whatever. So
happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. And how old are you? I know 29. Happy birthday, Sable. Love you. Right.
The picnic near the lakeside in Chicago is the start of a lazy afternoon, early one October. We begin with a scene 1 meter wide, which we view from just 1 meter away. Now, every 10 seconds, we will look from 10 times farther away, and our field of view will be 10 times wider. This square is 10 meters wide, and in 10 seconds, the next square will be 10 times as wide. Our picture will center on the picnickers, even after they've been lost to sight.
It's funny the things we forget to see.
So, at about 3.5 years old, she said she's riding in the van with us, and she said, say, Dad, you don't like Daddy Mark, do you? And I kind of look like, I wonder where this is coming from. So, but, like I said, I'm one of them parents think I'm going to tell my children the truth. I said, well, no, I don't. And she just looked at me and said, okay, that's fine. So she was sitting in my lap. Of course, I was a hustler, and I had a pistol in my waistband.
Yeah, something that can make you do wrong. Yeah. Love. Something that can make you do wrong. Yeah. Love. Yeah. Something that can make you do wrong. Yeah. Love. Yeah. Something that can make you do wrong. Yeah. Love.
You heard? Make sure you recognize that fucking name. Make sure you recognize that fucking name, you heard? I don't give a fuck about nobody else in this fucking train, but you right now.
Okay, that's
I'm ready to fuck your ass up right now.
Thank you. Thank you for caring about
So
it.
recognize that shit. You better fucking recognize that fucking name right now, ASAP.
I recognize it.
Recognize that shit ASAP. Fucking SAP. You don't put enough fucking fear in my heart.
So she was sitting in my lap. Of course, I was a hustler, and I had a pistol in my waistband. And when she sat back, she kind of bumped into it or felt it, right? Whatever. And she said, Daddy, what's that? Now, my friend, he's driving the van. He's looking at me at the corner of his eye like, saying, what are you going to say, whatever. So, again, I'm going to tell my children the truth. I said, it's a gun. And she said, oh, okay. So she thought about it. Then she said, well, why do you have a gun? And my friend looked at me again at the corner of his eye like, know what you gonna tell her now, big shot? So he didn't say nothing, but he just kind of like glanced at me at the corner of his eye. So I said, I told Eve I was a very, very important man.
So this is a talk in 4 parts: language, land, body, and prison. The parts are interchangeable and collide into and sort of fold around each other. I won't distinguish language, land, body, or prison. Where do either begin or end is a question for me. Can a conversation around prison be divorced from the body, for example? To begin, my practice examines the complex language and emotional landscapes embedded in a system of surveillance and the structures of constraint and the often invisible ways in which they shape our minds or direct our bodies. The images I just clicked through are a selection of the many California state prisons that my father's body has been in, and so by default my own. They're Calipatria, Centinela, Ironwood, and Avenal. These images weren't taken by me, though I've sort of shown them in exhibition context before. These images are produced by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and they're sort of usually shown on the websites next to the warden, like posing in front of an American flag. But that sort of doesn't really get to or sort of speak to the dissemination of these images, right? So they weren't made just for people to sort of happen upon them on the internet like I did. So I sort of became, or these images became a sort of shadow archive from which I'm sort of pulling, and the relationship between this landscape, for example, and this landscape is not dissimilar. Their bodies disappeared in these images, and a machine behind that disappearance, and just sort of a slow vibrating chord from time to time drawing them into focus. I showed a friend these images once during a studio visit, and that friend sort of referred to these images as a mass grave. And that's a phrase that kind of sticks with me still as I move through the day-to-day. Much of the practice as a whole is derived from the intersection of cinema, language, particularly the written text, image making, construction, deconstruction, and abstraction. So the institution sort of impetus and intentionality behind behind the sort of production of these images is a question. And I'm thinking about a sort of material syntax. I'm interested in the practice as a whole in the potential of language as object, folding itself around itself, its desire for accuracy and its sort of potential undoing. So at the core of the practice is a sort of desire to understand in many ways that trauma and violence is graphed and marked across bodies. To do this, we must look at the trickery of memory, the poetry sort of embedded in the fictions we create for ourselves, the fictions of our desires, the fictions of the systems and structures governing our lives. So how do we know what we're looking at? I like to say that I sort of work from the archive of my own body, creating a new syntax for knowing and not knowing, thereby marking the difference between witnessing and watching. And these are 2 very distinct subject positions, but think of the one who bears witness and the one who watches to consume or for entertainment. And obviously there's some sort of slipperiness between the 2, but I'm really sort of attuned to this act of looking. And then the act of being looked at, especially when mining content that might be specific to my personal history, and the language that sort of gets formed around that, especially in relationship to the carceral. A large portion of the practice is centered around mass incarceration, but again, it doesn't live there solely. And even trying to have a sort of conversation about mass incarceration is a lot more complicated than the kind of like buzzwords of the way that we think about it, or sort of are inundated with statistics. So again, using those aerial views of prison complexes as sort of a point of reference, and as well as the sort of architectural materials and markings of their interiors, I extract colors, blues in particular, demarcation lines, and other fragments that touch on the experience of visiting my father in various prisons over the past sort of 20 some odd years. The subsequent works for me begin to sort of examine and dismantle the regulatory codes that are both embedded in the body yet deeply impersonal. So what became hyper interesting to me over time as my body sort of moved in and out of these very charged spaces was that I developed a type of muscle memory. So that every time I crossed the threshold of the architecture of the prison, I started performing these sort of small gestures subconsciously, things that I obviously didn't consciously tell my body to start doing. And they were simple things at first, like adjusting my posture, right, tucking in and straightening my clothing, tempering the tone and volume of my speech. And so when I became aware of this, I started to sort of think about the other things that I may have internalized throughout my experience, moving in and out of these spaces or other structures that might be oppressive in ways. And I started to wonder and sort of obsess about the accumulation of these small and sometimes insignificant internalizations over time, like thinking about these sort of small touches and what that does to the body, right, and what that does to you. And so, for me, the landscape became this kind of like important space to intervene upon. So from thinking about things like the Hudson River School, to Avenal State Prison, to the sort of vernacular images that are produced inside of prisons, I began thinking through this series of neon sculptures that are sort of wrestling with a particular history of romantic landscape paintings, language, the carceral, and objecthood. But the sort of iconography of the prison visiting room murals and the vernacular images produced in front of them are images that I both participated in and possess. From my experience, but obviously in sort of research as well, a majority of the murals in California prisons are of this sort of oceanic scene or like a tropical kind of like landscape, and they're all littered with like these different, or these sort of multiple hues of blues. And it has like an aesthetic that's really sort of akin to, say, like a Caribbean cruise ship, right? So a nod to kind of tourism. But according to the prisons themselves, these images are, the images and the sort of production of the photographs in front of them are supposed to be this sort of form of escape for the inmate, or like a form of escape or sort of fantasy. But obviously this is a fallacy when you start to sort of really look, if one has to really look, right? Within the visiting space, there are so many reminders of that sort of hierarchies and constraint and stricture and the notion of freedom that sort of no one really escapes to like some sort of island breeze, right? Because you step in front of this image of a waterfall, right? Like I think it almost kind of like reinforces or sort of marks one's own sort of position of freedom, confinement, and time being in that space. And so in thinking about that, and obviously sort of thinking about this over time and being a participant in these spaces, I sort of became obsessed with the production of these images and began sort of thinking about the immaterial labor embedded in them, as well as their sort of mass reproduction through the Polaroid or sort of small format image. So the mural, which is that backdrop again, begins to sort of animate this silent performance between the incarcerated and the non-incarcerated persons that's sort of marked by trauma. And there's this sort of microeconomy enmeshed in the production of the visiting room image, which begins with the production of the mural, and that's why I sort of landed on it as like this kind of like focal point. So this kind of like labor is performed by a number of players in the visiting room space. So there's the guards, the muralist, who's usually an incarcerated person who is presumably unpaid for that labor, the photographer, who is also an incarcerated individual, potentially unpaid or paid only cents upon the dollar. There is the inmate, the camera, the visitor, and this sort of room full of spectators, right? So you're performing this intimacy sort of on display. And so what does that sort of mean, and what are the kind of like silent transgressions that kind of happen in that exchange? So from the investigation of these images came this sort of series of neon sculptures, which I'll sort of walk through closely. So I'm going to like show 3 of them right now, just kind of like name them, and we'll start to talk about them a little bit. But this first one is titled Landscape 1, and is 3 by 8 feet. And I kind of named the dimensions because the sort of scale and monumentality becomes important and sort of a part of the content. But this one reads, "And there are plenty boys out there screaming." Landscape 2 is 1.5 by 9 feet and reads, "Planking or the lying down game." Landscape 3 is 8 by 17.5 feet and reads, like the hands of the correctional officer on my abdomen, searching for metal, rather groping for the sake of taking over, for possession, to say in this moment you mean nothing, to show the value of touch. I touch deep inside every woman I fuck, fists beginning to clench and fold, fucking, screaming, punching, sweating through to the other side, asking liquid to do something more than drip. So the line in these neon works becomes a sort of horizon line, right? Like it's this sort of minimalist gesture that conjures the landscape image or iconography. The color of the mark furthers the image, so it's easy for green to be sort of pastoral or tropical, and blue to be sort of oceanic or nautical or sky. And for me, blue is also sort of doubly loaded. But it's also the sort of blue and green vibrate back and forth between the blue and green screens of video production, and a blue-black slippage between night and people and refusal. The orientation of the work itself can sort of oscillate back and forth between a horizon line and something else, and it kind of collapses multiple planes on top of itself. So maybe it's more obvious in Landscape 3, but also Landscape 2, where one of the sort of literal images that it renders, or that the text reads, is the image of a body lying on pavement, or rather the residue of that body, or both, right? Making it simultaneously an aerial view as well. So like planking, right? Of course that sort of points to the viral fad or like game of like lying the body down, flat and stiff in like odd or difficult places. Which itself is an absurdity, right? If you think about one sort of having the luxury to see a body lying on the ground and like have that as a sense of sort of enjoyment or a game, right? Where other people's sort of experience of seeing a body lying down, right, has a very different connotation. So there's already like an interest in sort of play or privilege and like thinking about this as sort of a game or as like a leisure activity. While the sort of color yellow next to the word landscape potentially conjures sort of the image of a sun or a sunset, right? So the text of this piece begins to sort of evoke, if we're thinking about the sort of color play again, like a chalk outline or a caution tape amongst other things. The line, of course, below all of these works as a whole never serves as a ground. The text or the sort of material cannot rest on it, right? It's fragile. It has a sort of false stability, an illusion that's just as much as a sort of perspectival position. So in these works, I'm sort of more acutely concerned with the landscapes or the sort of backdrops that certain demographics of people find themselves as performers for and within. And for me, there's obviously sort of this direct relationship to the backdrops in front of which the sort of vernacular images are produced inside of a prison visiting space. And these scapes are sort of many. They're landscapes, dreamscapes, etc. And with these works specifically, I'm thinking a lot about Hito Strile's essay in Free Fall here. Specifically, the neon works have a relationship to painting, obviously, and so therefore figure and ground are sort of functioning on multiple levels, but I'm more interested in the instability here, and this sort of coy sliding between abstraction and representation, hence language describing image and becoming image simultaneously. And the neons do become backdrops. Time and time again, viewers in the sort of exhibition space, right, like try to image or sort of take selfies of themselves in front of the neons, right? And this is something that I was like hyper aware of nowadays. Everyone sort of walks through the museum like looking through their phone or trying to sort of photograph themselves. And so I knew, again, with like thinking about a material as sort of lush and seductive as neon and the scale, that this would be sort of a point where people would want to try to capture themselves, right? But sort of neon as a material, unless you're a trained photographer, almost refuses to be captured when a body is placed in front of it. So there is this kind of like tension or this negotiation between the two, right? What can be captured and what can't be captured. And there's a frustration that happens in that. And so outside of the image and sort of the text of the work, that kind of like negotiation between trying to participate or trying to capture or like the refusal of its participation becomes a part of the kind of like conceptual framework of thinking about this sort of series of neons. So the piece almost kind of becomes time-based in a way, that it's sort of read as an image, but also in the reading of its language, it sort of renders multiple images simultaneously. So there's the image that the narrative of the text creates, and then there's this sort of image of a conceptual landscape that's sort of marked by a blue horizon line. And like those sort of Western landscape paintings that I was sort of pointing to in the beginning, the piece is obsessed with light, right? But here it's sort of a harsh, artificial light, and not the sort of celebrated sublime of natural light or its rendition that those sort of paintings are kind of talking about. And again, like obviously with a piece like this work is sort of about power in many ways, but I think most successfully in its materiality, tucked away at the bottom here are 11 transformers. So the work itself is literally sucking power from the institution that it's installed in. So there's a labor that's sort of embedded in this. And with neon, like multiple sort of light sources, specifically fluorescence, which I'm thinking about as a material that sort of proliferates the interiors of a number of sort of institutional spaces, there's sort of a sonic quality, right? So there's like a subtle buzz that's present. And for me, that buzz becomes a kind of constant motif to talk about invisibility. And it sort of shows up again in a work like this, which is untitled. And the text of this piece reads, "Their words pass through with a blue-greenness. The thicker the glass, the fluorescent light, it buzzes, it cannot be drowned out. If you think it ceased, it's because the buzz has now become a part of you. You walk around with it. I walk around with it, becoming." And again, these are kind of like complicated works that have a number of sort of layers that aren't necessarily fully kind of captured in the like slick documentation that a show provides you with. But obviously, so this piece deals with language, but it also sort of uses the materiality and the gestures of the carceral space, right? So there's like, in like a very kind of like simplistic way, or like a small sort of gesture, right? There's glass, doors, locks, metal in a frame. And again, what you don't see here is the surface of the glass is always sort of capturing the image of the one who's in front of it. So it almost becomes a kind of like analog camera at times, sort of shuffling through bodies across its surface, archiving, rendering, erasing. And so there's that thing again, the body, which I'm sort of concerned with and the work is concerned with. The viewer's body, my body, the bodies of those sort of cataloged away and choreographed by others, by structures, where work might be located in the body, where the impetus for or the vibration for a scream comes from, how the body is pried apart when that scream is deafening, and where pain lives, where memory lies, and all the ways that the body sort of triggers from its own remembering or re-rendering. I once wrote across those sort of walls of this residency space that I was a part of in black letters these words, which then sort of turned into the book project, which was a part of this issue. We are a weird triangle of silence and smiles and pauses, of stepping backwards one foot after another, until we found the cold corner of a wall. It straightens my back. I try to stand flat against it, knowing that my body holds a weight way before my memory, and I can only thank it for not creating the language around itself. So again, text, of course, becomes integral to the practice, but these words sort of came after I was thinking through this essay titled "Knowing and Not Knowing: Massive Psychic Trauma, Forms of Traumatic Memory." And I encountered this essay through this book by Kathy Carruth, Listening to Trauma. But for me, the book didn't necessarily provide language. Instead, it used language to sort of create a shape around the void, that space that can't or sort of refuses to be captured, or the space where language fails. And that's due to trauma, yes, and the scholarship the book is talking about. But it's also sort of a condition present when subjects are rendered objects. And here I'm thinking about black bodies, the performance of blackness and blackness. And so this is the sort of residue of the things that I'm wrestling with in the work. Or as Fred Moten has articulated in his book, In the Break, an issue here is the precariousness of empathy and the uncertain line between witness and spectator. Only more obscene than the brutality unleashed at the whipping post is the demand that the suffering be materialized and evidenced by the display of the tortured body, or endless recitations of the ghastly and terrible. In light of this, how does one give expression to those outrages without exasperating the indifference to suffering that is the consequence of the bemoaning spectacle, or contend with the narcissistic identification that obliterates the other, or the prurience that too often is the response to such displays? So basically, how do we picture violence? And for me, I'm sort of looking at a quotidian violence, the sort of invisible interactions and transgressions of the day-to-day, and I'm more concerned in the work, at least, with their sort of profound impact over time, more so than a catastrophic. The formal attention is really rooted in the poetic, in fragmentation, a repetition is about disillusion, collage, the landscape of memory, and a tension between narrative and non-narrative. The video work, of course, has a relationship to experimental cinema, but also an engagement with a cinematic syntax. So I'm invested in a boundary dissolution, and a seamless sort of shift from position to position, context to context, frame to frame, and all the sort of messy, complicated parts. And I think that sort of becomes evident in like the sort of materiality of the work masquerading or sort of taking on the properties or trying to sort of wrestle with the sort of history of another medium, right? And sort of slipping in and out of each other. So for me, this is the sort of structure of the work. Or the work is sort of about structure in the frame. And particularly this question of sort of looking and then producing things that are then looked at. So maybe we'll stop there. We can jump into questions.
Can you talk more about how your father imagines or talks about participating in, like, collaborating, like the idea of collaborating with someone, with a subject who's unfree, and who's coerced into all kinds of other relationships to the state and the like. So,
yeah.
What does consent mean in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, maybe like a kind of like tangent example. It's like a video piece that I didn't show here, but there's like one. Okay, so in the videos, me and my father like figure out a number of sort of weird ways to like collaborate, and he doesn't think he's making art, and he doesn't think I'm making out arts half the time. I don't know what that is, but it creates a lot of interest in sort of conversations. But one project that we've been sort of working on is like this series of video works. And what happens is I ask him to send me videos. So he can send me whatever he wants to do or tell me stories, right? Like that's the only directive. And then when I get content from him in the kind of like art brain of mine, I have to sort of respond to it some kind of way in a timeline. And in exchange for a video he sends me, I send him back something that has to do with my everyday life, right? Which becomes like a more authentic way of like communicating and having a relationship than me like, I don't know, itemizing all my accomplishments or sort of everything that I'm doing right on a letter that has a type of formality to it, even if like there are ways or sort of spaces for us to try to be intimate, right? Like if I'm walking down 125th and I show him like this is my neighborhood, that feels like a more real way for him to kind of see and understand like who I am after all of these years of like not physically being in the same space with me. So that became important as like a process to making the videos, right? Like it's about that kind of like call and response conversation. But also the kind of like agency and his decision of what to shoot, right? Becomes really fascinating every time sort of I get an image back. So he sent me this one video where he's just like sitting on his bed, like vibing out, listening to an Alicia Keys song. And so I got that video and I was like, oh, this is fucking incredible, right? Like when I ask someone to like shoot something, right? Like create some content that you deem is important, right? And the thing that he deemed was important was like him having this sort of moment of like potentially escape, or just like a moment of leisure, a moment of kind of like peace and freedom of like just enjoying a thing that like potentially we'll all take for granted, but it means so much more coming from him, right? So like then that becomes the content that sort of goes in a video, and then I have to figure out a way to sort of respond to or like deal with that or reckon with that. That sort of emotional content, but then also like finding a way to not frame, but just like sit something next to that video that like even reinforces the kind of like weight and gravity of it. So yeah, maybe that's one example that kind of like gets to it.
Any other questions?
You have a pretty extensive practice, you multifaceted. Which part of it is the most challenging for you? Or can you talk about one particular part of it? Or is it all?
I mean, I don't know, right? Like making art is hard. To try to, I mean, I guess if I'm thinking about sort of spaces in my practice, I think the writing, right? Like things that are like not text that becomes a neon or becomes a sign or like is a part of a video, but like trying to sit down and put a word on paper is like the most kind of like difficult thing to wrestle with. I think, I don't know, I don't like have all the kind of like language to wrap around it, but I think there's more of a, there's more intimacy and potential vulnerability, right? Because like writing gets sort of like labeled or classified, or like a genre is placed on it in a very specific way. So then if it enters the world, then like, you know, people will read this as nonfiction or biography, and then like there's all these questions that you have to sort of answer to potentially when you put it on the record, right? Which can be slightly different in, I think, a visual work. So maybe that's hard. I just think writing is like a hard practice in general. It takes me forever to like write something. Yeah.
Did you need any like special permission to shoot in prison, or is there like
Good
rules?
Yeah, there are tons of rules. It's all illegal what I'm doing. There's no permission. It's an illegal cell phone. Everybody in the prison system has them, and that's a part of the work that isn't like at the forefront of the way that the work is talked about, but it's the way the work is contextualized, because it's, again, like, though the video might seem kind of like an intimate kind of like portrait, or like, I mean, there's a number of ways that like people can kind of like classify it, but like the actual structure of like thinking about creating like media content and using that appropriated footage is one. So like all these kind of like tropes of like black masculinity or like criminality, right? And like appropriating those videos, but then also the fact that like his participation is through a microeconomy that happens in the prison space that everyone is complicit in because correctional officers sell cell phones.
Yeah.
Kasha?
I can say it out loud. Have you seen the Bible pieces?
Of course.
Yes. What's his
Because they got a cell phone. So I text him to him. Yeah, again, it's like I don't know, it's funny. Yeah, I think it's funny to me because, right, like I'll send him a thing, like he knows, okay, you're an artist. We can talk about painting because I understand that, but the other shit, I don't know what you're doing. And I'll send him a thing, and I'm like, we worked on this, and it's like, oh, I don't know what this is. I don't get this. And then 5 seconds later, we'll end up having a 4-hour conversation about the most profound things that, like, I didn't even know. Like, I'm like, this is a conversation I would assume I'd be having with a PhD student. I can't even catch up, right? And it's all out of, like, the kind of process of making the work, but then also looking at the way that, like, I process the kind of, like, visual input and send it back. So, yeah. Better conversations than I have with curators.
Is that process feeding into the writing you're doing, the book you're working on? Like, are you able to document the process in some kind of way?
That's a good question. I guess not intentionally yet. I think maybe there's like informal or kind of subtle ways that it's coming out, but like it isn't something I've like intentionally started to do yet. But there is like, I don't know, ways that I guess potentially like it eventually should show up or something. Yeah.
Has your father ever asked you not to show something that you worked on with him?
No. And I mean, I asked him, right? Because obviously there's like a lot of things behind it. And like, I don't know, dealing with like personal content is fine when you only have to answer to yourself, but then when you bring in other people or you have to answer to someone else's narrative, right? Like for me, there's a type of ethics that, or responsibility that I feel like I have to uphold, right? So I have a parameter, a sort of a litmus test of like, how to make sure that I feel like this thing is okay in the world. And then try to control the language around that, right? Because like, anytime you sort of present something in the public sphere, like we can only control the language to a certain extent, and then like anybody can like go crazy and write all these kind of things about it, which they do. But the more text, right, that's sort of out there brushing up against those things, the more sort of energy it has or something.
Well, thank you so much, Sable. Let's give them a round of applause.